Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead now.
Yeah. Good evening, one and all. On behalf of IDA Andhra Pradesh State Branch, I welcome you all for today's webinar. As Helen Steiner Rice very aptly said in her poem, "This too shall pass, hang on." Daily we are receiving distressing calls from near and dear for advices, emotional support, and for various other needs. We can minimize these critical situations by early recognition and timely intervention. As famous quote says, helping hands are better than praying lips. IDA AP State Branch has taken an initiative to make all the dentists aware of mild cases and necessary measures to be taken in the golden hour. Now I request our IDA AP State Branch President, Dr. Satish Goenka, to address the participants. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Satish.
Thank you, Dr. Sudisha. First of all, good evening to everybody, and welcome to this beautiful webinar. I'm definitely going to tell you that Dr. Shashi is going to tell you about the simple things, how can a home isolation be done, what care to be taken and all. I thank Dr. Shashi for accepting our request, and I request the moderators, Dr. Chaudhary, to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Satish. Good evening, all. Thank you for being here this evening. There are more people alive today than have ever died. We all know how the current pandemic situation is outside our doors. We are running short of beds in the hospitals, oxygen supply, and even medicines too. Now it's time for us, being a dentist, to learn and manage a COVID patient at our glance. It is a great opportunity created by IDA AP State to gain knowledge regarding how to treat a COVID patient at home isolation. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Sasi, a very special guest from UAE, Dubai. Dr. Sasi is a specialist emergency physician at Government Rashid Hospital and Trauma Center under Dubai Health Authority. Currently, it is a tertiary COVID care center, and he is also working as a lecturer in Dubai Medical College. He has done his post-graduation in Accident and Emergency Medicine at Vinayaka Mission University, Salem, Tamil Nadu, and he has done his undergraduation in Andhra Medical College under Dr. NTR University of Health Sciences, Andhra Pradesh. He had conducted various workshops across the globe, and he has many international and national publications. And today he will be sharing with us his expertise opinion regarding the pandemic situation, especially how to guide a COVID patient to manage at home isolation. He will be driving us from day 1 to day 14, how to manage our near and dears of COVID patients and make them normal from the disease. We request all the participants to put your questions in the chat box of the moderators, which can be answered later. With that, I ask you all to give your full attention to Dr. Sasi and help me in welcoming him onto the screen, please. Dr. Sasi, it's all yours.
Thank you, team. Very good evening. It's afternoon for us here. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I just want to enlighten few aspects. So we are not going to discuss about patients who will be needing critical care, who will be needing an intensive care unit, or who will be needing hospitalization, or very sick patients, because this number is very less. When you take the relative number of patients who are COVID positive, who are staying back at home, lack of access to immediate healthcare, with the overwhelming load on the hospitals and the doctors and healthcare, I just thought this brief presentation will be a bit of help for the specific sect of population who just want to stay at home and see what are the alarming signs and when to get to a hospital, when to get to the doctor, and when do they need a medical assistance and all. So just to begin with, this pandemic, it has shattered many. When we talk about when we talk about to near and dear and family, many of them tells that, in the near and dear, we have lost this many members in the family and all. But if you can just, I'll tell you one thing before we start. Whatever news you hear from your dear and near telling that they are very sick in the hospital or who didn't make it out well, if you can just go back and dig out the history, exactly what happened, what did lead to the hospitalization and all. It was all an initial 3 to 5 days of neglected symptoms, neglected fever, delayed diagnosis. And only these sect of population, if you see most of them, I'll see the majority of them who are ending up in ICUs, intensive care units, majority of the patients who are ending up in the critical care units who are not making it out well. Most of them, if you dig up the initial history and all, the initial 3 to 5 day crucial period, this is missed. This is missed for unnecessary investigations, giving a swab, which at some places you will get the report in 2 to 3 days. And sometimes most of the swabs, few swabs come positive, few swabs come negative. And if the swab come negative, the patient will be having a false reassurance. In fact, it could be a false negative even. So all in the 5th, 6th day, they start crashing fast, where the basic concept of home care will be out of reach. So this concept, I'll tell you, if someone is presenting with symptoms from day 1, from day 2, with proper home monitoring system, I'll tell you, none of them will be missed. None of them will be ending up in a hospital. None of them will be ending up in an ICU. I'm telling you, most 90 to 95% of the cases. Someone calls you, giving you history of a fever, body aches, myalgia, and right now this episode is even coming with GI symptoms, abdominal bloating, multiple episodes of diarrhea, severe myalgias, cough will be sometimes presenting late, headache, body aches and all. In this current pandemic, of course, if you want to investigate the patient, you can work him up for malaria, dengue, typhoid. But what I feel is we are wasting the golden hour in digging up things. When we are talking about a pandemic which has engulfed in a mass scale, so it's foolish to think about other differential diagnoses. Like a patient comes with fever in this current scenario, someone calls you, we cannot tell them, okay, go and get a malaria test done, go and get a dengue test done, go and get a Widal test done and all. So in general, because we are talking about home care, we are talking about case, even the labs are so overwhelmed and it's difficult to get even an appointment for a PCR swab. So we cannot tell the patient, okay, go get a PCR swab and come. It takes 2 days. What I'll suggest you, we will start monitoring from day 1. We'll presume it to be COVID. There's no wrong. We are not going to give any drugs. We are not going to give any medications which we cannot undo, which will hit the patient's system badly, which will injure his kidneys or stuff and all. So we will try to be focused from day 1. If someone gives you a complaint, for me, in this pandemic time, someone tells me that I have fever, body aches, I will consider it to be COVID. I will not waste time or the patient's money and time spending for unnecessary testing, go for a PCR or a rapid antigen or a CT scan and all. The first thing what I'll tell the patient is just get a pulse oximeter at home. A simple pulse oximeter on the finger is your CT scan. You can see a live thing, what is happening in your lungs, because CT is a one-time modality, right? If example, I get a CT today on day 1 of my symptoms, and after 3 days, if my symptoms worsen, I cannot repeat a CT after 3rd day. I cannot repeat a CT on the 5th day. This is not something which I can repeat every day. But this pulse oximeter on the finger, we advocate them just to get a pulse oximeter and a basic thermometer. So I'm not, in this big pandemic scenario, when people are talking about big things like remdesivir, tocilizumab, oxygen, ventilator and all, it will be like a foolish act me telling about a simple pulse oximeter or thermometer. But I'll tell you how it works. So we are talking about a mass population who are staying at home and whole families being affected with fevers and all. So we cannot advocate them, all of you go for PCR testing, all of you go for an antigen testing or CTs. It's not practically possible. Even resources are limited. Even you go for a lab to get, in metros especially, to get an appointment for the labs, they'll be coming after 2 to 3 days. And even you try to get an appointment, the reports will be delayed for 2 to 3 days. So the first thing, if someone tells us that they're having symptoms which are mimicking COVID, we will ask them to first check, do you have a pulse oximeter at home? Do you have a thermometer at home? This is what we monitor. From day 1, we are priming our client or the patient, we are priming him well so that we want him to face the worst in the next few days or in the end of first week or in the beginning of 2nd week. This is a turbulent phase. So we are just preparing him. So how do we prepare him? So forget about antivirals, steroids, stuff and all. First, let's start our cycle with breaking one simple chain. So we'll talk about breaking a simple chain of fever. Simple fever chain breaking, I'll tell you. If the fever is not managed properly, so most of them, they have fever. They take 1 to 2 paracetamol a day. Fevers will not be well controlled. This will cause a lot of dehydration for the patients. Once they're dehydrated, the next day they'll be having lack of energy. They'll not be able to take anything orally and all. They'll be in a bit of acidosis and all. So what happens when they're dehydrated? They'll be having an acute kidney injury. You see patients all on the 3rd, 4th day who have not taken proper paracetamol timely, who have not broken the cycle of fever. They'll be having an acute kidney injury element just because of dehydration. They'll have a derangement in creatinine. I'll tell you why this is important. In the 3rd day, during the viral replication, if you want to have a choice of starting an antiviral, so I want to start favipiravir for my patient. The first thing is I want to ensure that his renal function is fine, his creatinine is fine. But what happens in the first 2-3 days, if his fevers are not well controlled, if he's not taking proper oral fluids and all, so obviously his creatinine will be deranged. So I have to delay the antiviral, which I have to give him. First, I have to give him fluids. I have to bring back his creatinine to normal. Then only I'll be able to start antiviral. So we are wasting a golden period there. So from the beginning, if we are prepared, we'll ensure proper hydration of the patient, because normally we will be needing at least 3 liters of fluid. But someone with fever, they'll be having a lot of fluid losses from the body. So their fluid requirements will be 1 to 2 liters higher. So we have to advocate plenty of fluids. These plenty of fluids, they cannot be taken at once. So someone takes fluid at once, they'll have nausea, vomiting. Right? So we advocate to take fluid in sips of fluids. So continuous sips of fluids and frequent paracetamol dosing. So what happens when we give frequent paracetamol and continuous sips of fluids? At least we are avoiding dehydration. You might not be able to prevent viral replication with this, of course. You'll not be able to prevent a cytokine storm with this, for sure. But at least you're preventing dehydration. You're not letting the lungs dry. So what happens once the lungs are dry, all the mucus plugs, they get crusted in the lungs and they get, you cannot dislodge them from the lung. They get crusted and they get organized. So this is when the saturations drop. So you need to keep the lungs wet. You need to keep your kidneys wet for you to prime yourselves to start on the medications, whatever you want. You want to start steroid, depending on the protocol, the timing of steroid, the timing of antiviral, whatever medication if you want to give, the body should be primed well. So the body should be having a normothermia and properly hydrated. This is the first cycle which we need to break the cycle of fever. And saturations check. We need to ask the patient to keep updating us the saturations. We need to give him a cutoff limit. Of course, if someone tells you that I have dipping saturations, we ask them, we reassure them first. We ask them to check saturations in multiple other fingers. We'll just see if the pulse oximeter is functioning properly. The batteries are adequate. We ask them to check it in multiple fingers. So if the values are uniform and consistent in all the fingers, then the alarming for me to set what degree or what level of saturations you want to set is, for me, I'm not comfortable even with 95. Of course, this is not to panic people. 95 is normal, but you need to tell it to the people so they'll be extra cautious. So once it touches 95, we are not going to rush or jump to treatment. So he's going to monitor. Is it dipping down from 95, 94, 93, or it is stable and moving up? So once he's touching 94, then this is when we start to advocate. So we see, are your fevers controlled with simple paracetamol, proper hydration, tepid sponging? Sometimes even paracetamol and hydration will not bring down fevers. So you need to give continuous cold sponging of the body. So in spite of giving cold sponging, in spite of giving paracetamol and a lot of fluids, in spite of this, the fever is persistent. This is when we need to act. So I'm telling you, in the very early phase, this is the viral replication time. This is the time when you need to start on an antiviral. But before that, so do you have any contraindications to check? Yeah. Yes, I asked the patient, do you have any kidney disease? If the patient doesn't have any kidney disease, you need not check the creatinine, because the patient have an access, this is all delay of care. And you see the patient is hydrated well and not dehydrated. Patient is dehydrated, you cannot put on these medications. Regarding the antiviral, we don't advocate. Even there is no FDA approval. All the antivirals are tested in vitro. In vivo, still there are a lot of research studies are going on. still there is no proper FDA approval for any drug. But here I'll tell you, we have two promising drugs what we hear of every day. So we have your Favipiravir or Fabiflu or whatever brands advocate. So it's a Favipiravir or your Remdesivir. So we have two drugs. So, but for sure, the WHO has reserved, even the European Union or the American College of Physicians, they have reserved Remdesivir only for patients admitted in the hospital who are sick and who are needing oxygen requirements. So obviously, you are not going to give Remdesivir for someone at home. The administration is difficult. First of all, even before the administration, getting access to the drug, it's very difficult to get an access to drug. So you cannot tell the patient's family something which is not available and make them run around to get the drug. So we are talking about home. So Remdesivir is out of the list here. It is reserved for patients who are admitted in the hospital, who are having low oxygen and who are needing oxygen requirements. And that too, after the viral replication phase, after the time where you spread it, after the 12th day, after the 10th or 12th day, no antiviral has a role. No antiviral has a role. After the 10th, there's no use of giving Remdesivir on the second week, end of second week, even if the patient is sick. There are other things you need to address for the patient at that time. It is not Remdesivir. So when we talk about the initial first week of fever, we don't have an option of Remdesivir. First, it's an IV preparation and availability. So we have in the market Favipiravir, you have whatever brand is available. So this initial viral replication phase, we initially start with an antiviral, which is available over the counter, of course, with a doctor's prescription. So you start antiviral, you see in the first 1 to 2 days, are the fevers settling down with your paracetamol, with your hydration, with your tepid sponging and initiation of antiviral. Still, even after initiation of antiviral, after the initial loading doses itself, you should see a response. After the initial loading doses of 16 to 1800 milligram, twice daily dosing, you should be seeing a response in the fever trend. In spite of starting this antiviral, if you see the fever trend going up, not getting down, so this is when we assume that the patient is in some sort of cytokine storm. Of course, if you want evidence for this, yes, you can ask the patient to get an interleukin level, ferritin, LDH stuff and all, of course. So when you talk about this access to all these tests, even we give it in sub-centers, small centers, they have to send these labs to a higher center. They don't process it in the same city. Most of the towns, they are available in metros and few big cities, not in all the places. So here you cannot tell the patient, okay, now your fevers are not settling down. Okay, now you go to a lab, you get your interleukin levels and you come back to me. No, you start, what is wrong in starting a steroid for him right now? And even this, and another actual valid point at this time on what basis we start this steroid is, you need to monitor saturations even. If the saturations are touching 95, 94, dipping down, this is when you need to intervene, dipping saturations. This is when the patient should be on steroid and antiviral. So earlier antiviral, not steroid, because during the viral replication phase, we don't give steroid. It bursts, no? The viral replication still explodes. So you need to cover with an antiviral and then you introduce steroid. This should happen in the initial 3 days, third day, at least third. Because day 1, I cannot tell a patient, take antiviral, take steroid. Day 2 also, I will see. I will give paracetamol. I will do a lot of measures to control the fever, to avoid dehydration. Day 3, all my efforts are in vain. I have to intervene with something. So I'll start with an antiviral. So once the antiviral is started, still the fevers are high, still the oxygen saturations are dipping. This is when the role of steroid comes in. Okay. The choice of steroid, dexamethasone is a cheaper one. It's available worldwide. So a lot of studies have been done on that. It's not that dexamethasone is superior. It is studied well. So it is advocated. So the problem with dexamethasone, we don't have oral 4 mg availability or 8 milligram availability as such. So we have normally in the market, we have 0.5 mg. So when you ask the patient to take 8 tablets of 0.5 mg in the morning and 8 tablets in the evening, this guy will be panicked. I think what doctor is giving me a bunch of medicines to gulp in. So based on this availability, you even can advocate methylprednisolone, which is no way inferior, or prednisolone depending on the availability. I'll give you the dosing regimen, the equivalent dosing regimen. The equivalent dosing regimen will be for a 6 milligram of steroid per day, you'll be having a dosing regimen equivalent to 32 milligram of methylprednisolone, or a 40 milligram of prednisolone, or a 150 milligram of hydrocortisone. So easily available will be for you either a 6 to 8 milligram of dexamethasone, so which you can equate to 32 milligram of methylprednisolone or 40 milligram of prednisolone. This is per day dosing on the whole day, I'm telling you. So selection of steroid is, again, it's not only the doctor's choice. It's not the patient. It's based on the availability in the market. So you go to a shop, you don't have dexamethasone, you go for the next alternative. So we don't stick that I needed dexamethasone, because in this SAR, resources are very limited. We are trying to utilize what all resources we have to give best for the patient at home. So whatever resources we have, we use. Okay, even you don't have methylprednisolone, yes, give me at least prednisolone. I take prednisolone at least. Okay, so steroid. So this should be started after the antiviral, just because we don't want to give steroid earlier to explode the viral replication. So you cover him with an antiviral first. See the patient is not settling down, you start on steroid. Choice of steroid is yours. And here, in the first 1 to 2 days, we might have doubts, doctor. The first 1 to 2 days, why are you waiting? Why are you advocating an antiviral? Why are you advocating a steroid? Why can't we give doxycycline, which is easily available and cheap? Why can't we give an ivermectin? Why can't we give an hydroxychloroquine? Why can't we give an azithromycin? I'll tell you, you can see the reviews, literature everywhere. There is hydroxychloroquine is out of the list. This was during the first wave where hydroxychloroquines were advocated. Now you see it has no role. It has no role in prophylaxis or initial management. It's of no use you give it for the patient. So the next comes your azithromycin. No, zero role unless the patient is having some secondary bacterial infections. That too, they'll be coming down in the second week after a viral infection. Azithromycin has no role. It's no role. We see a lot of prescriptions with us. This is where we are wasting the golden period. At least instead of azithro or antibiotics, put him on an antiviral. So then comes doxy. Doxy is a culprit because you give doxy. Of course, it has an antiviral action, antibacterial, it says theoretically, but no, it's not proved. It causes very bad gastritis. A lot of patients I have seen who are on doxy, they start to vomit severely. This vomiting, they'll not be able to take anything orally. Severe dehydration, acute kidney injury. This is where your chain reaction starts. So you give doxy, this patient will start vomiting, that's the end of it. Now again, you have to give him antiemetics. Sometimes oral antiemetics might not work. Again, you have to give him IV antiemetics just because of doxy. Ivermectin, to some extent, it is proved to be effective against SARS in vitro studies, but not in vivo. In vivo, if you want ivermectin to be effective against SARS coronavirus or your COVID-19, the doses are much, much, much higher. And these doses will be toxic for us. If you really want to give an ivermectin to counteract our COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 virus, the doses what you can administer, they'll be a toxic doses for us. So simple 12 milligram is not going to do anything. These are the doses which are tested only in vitro, not in vivo. In vivo, these doses are not enough. So you cannot pump him in with the doses which is toxic for us. So even ivermectin is out of the list. It's out of the list. Azithro, doxy, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, no role. It's better you give him good pantoprazole, some paracetamol, hydration, antiemetics or whatever, better than giving these medications. At least the patient will be hydrated. You are nicely priming the patient. You are priming him well. You are keeping him well hydrated. You are seeing that this patient doesn't have any acute kidney injury. So that this patient might be needing on the third day or between second, third, fourth days, he might be needing an antiviral like favipiravir, which should ensure a proper functioning kidney. So you are priming him from day one. You start with temperature control. So on the third day, we start with an antiviral, which can be easily done at home. Of course, with continuous monitoring of fevers and saturations. Then you start him on a steroid. So now you have given your paracetamol, tepid sponging, fluids, steroids, and antivirals. In spite of giving all of these, still the patient has high grade fevers. So this is when you should consider the dose adjust. This is not the time where, okay, still there is fever. Okay, let's put an antibiotic. No, this is not the way. So this means the actual dosing of steroid is not enough what we are giving for the patient. You should be considering a stepping up of dose of steroid to counteract the cytokine storm. So if you want to, if you ask me, doctor, do you think the patient is in cytokine storm? I don't know. clinically, yes, patient is throwing high-grade fevers in spite of giving all the antipyretic measures, in spite of giving antivirals, in spite of giving steroids, still is throwing high-grade fevers. Please step up the dose of steroid. Antibiotic has no role at this point. So this is how we go. So this is the main strategy: fever control, an antiviral, and steroid in the order of sequence. And probably you need to consider stepping up the dose of steroid if the temperatures are not well controlled or the saturations are dipping. So this is a drug part. Then coming to supplements, we have a lot of supplements: vitamin D, C, zinc. I don't say not to use them. So once a prescription becomes very long for the patient, he will get fed up. He'll be getting vexed up. No, he'll not be able to take this much bunch of medications. So he might omit the actually needed medications. He might skip the antiviral. He might skip a steroid, more relying on these. I don't say not to give them, but don't give them much importance. And even these supplements, they are effective before COVID. No? So we are just taking supplements so that we are well immune competent to fight COVID. Once the COVID has set in, do you think supplements have a role? COVID has already set in for us. At this phase, so supplements will be in the last in the list in the prescription. So in between, just above the supplements, we have a drug. You have N-acetylcysteine. No? You have it in different brand names. You have effervescent tablets. Like I should not advocate any brand here, but you have a lot of effervescent tablets. You have it in combination with a bronchodilator like acebrophylline combination. So you have these patterns. So what will this pulmoclear do? Because you are loading him with paracetamol for fever. You are giving him a lot of paracetamol, mostly 3 grams per day. Of course, it's not a toxic dose, but still you are giving a lot of paracetamol for the patient. Still the fevers are not coming down. This N-acetylcysteine, it can counteract the ill effects of paracetamol on the liver, on the hepatic system with N-acetylcysteine. N-acetylcysteine, it is a renal protectant. Because of dehydration, you can have an acute kidney injury. You know, when we give a contrast medium for CT scans and all, there are studies to advocate N-acetylcysteine. At least you have a theoretical advantage of protecting the kidneys. So at least in theory, it protects the kidneys. Definitely it is protective for the liver. And it is a mucolytic. It breaks the mucus chain in the lung. So it will help you to bring out the expectorations. So you are clearing your lung alveoli. You are recruiting more alveoli into the respiration so that your saturations pick up. So I advocate use of, along with this, your N-acetylcysteine. You can take it in any form. Effervescent form, you can just dilute it in water, dissolve it in water and take. You can take it in combination with a bronchodilator, especially if you have patients who are asthmatics. You have this N-acetylcysteine in combination with your acebrophylline. So you can give this combination, it helps. So, and other form of N-acetylcysteine, you have an injectable form. While they're not much available in the market, but still you can get them. You have different brand names. N-acetylcysteine 400 milligram. It is actually for an IV injection. So off the record, off-label use, what we do, we break the ampule, we just place it in the nebulizer and we give it as nebulization. So that you are just giving it directly to the lung. So this is where it helps to break the mucus. It will help to mobilize the secretions. And when the secretions are mobilized, the alveoli are more aeration in the alveoli. This is how the saturations pick up. So this we can advocate N-acetylcysteine oral form in combination with an acebrophylline or any bronchodilator for asthmatics, or N-acetylcysteine in form of a nebulizer. And the next one, people ask a lot of things. What is steam inhalation? There are many theories which say if you inhale steam, the virus which is in the nose will go into the lungs. So our system is a single system what we have from nose to trach. There are no barricades here. The virus wants to move, it will move freely. It is not your simple inhalation which will push it. But here the actual thing for steam inhalation is the water what you are using or the steamer what you are using, it should be clean properly. Because right now we are hearing a lot of, we'll talk about it. A lot of mucormycosis or black fungus, what we are hearing common language. So we see that the system where you're taking a steam inhalation or even your nebulizer, they're cleaned properly. And the purpose of advocating a steam is not to kill the virus. Because steam, to kill the virus, it has to kill your lungs. No? It has to burn down your lungs to kill the virus first. So this steam is only, again, you see sometimes when we eat a lot of hot things, you have something secreting out from the nose. You will have just secretions pouring out of the nose when we are eating something hot or spicy. So these steam inhalation, again, it will help to liquefy the mucus, which is hardened up, crusted mucus in the lungs. It will help to liquefy. And once the steam is done, this liquefied mucus, with the help of N-acetylcysteine, it will break the mucus and you can expectorate it out. You can give a good expectorant like a dextromethorphan syrup. You can bring it out. People, because most common complaint, what we hear is cough. First thing, if someone tells you about cough, you just prepare them mentally. My dear, the cough will be there for 1 month. Please don't ask about cough. It will be there for 1 month. The only thing is, give steam, give good nebulization with your N-acetylcysteine, give an expectorant so that he will cough it out. So this is regarding steam. Then comes your nebulization. This is all home. You can have a steamer at home. You can have a nebulizer at home. If the patient is an asthmatic, he says, I have a lot of wheezes, even audible wheezes. You can give a combination of levosalbutamol or ipratropium, whatever brands you have in the market. Next comes your inhalational steroid, your budesonide, Budecort or anything. Inhalational steroid, which helps to some extent. This is again for the inflammatory part in the lung. You're giving the delivery directly. But here there are many times a question whether you give metered dose inhaler directly into the puff into the mouth, or you want to give a mask through the nebulizer. Normally you see the literature, you see the pulmonologists advocating only a puff. They don't advise a nebulizer. I'll tell you why. It is not that the nebulizer is inferior or the puff is superior. The problem is this nebulizer, it will have a lot of aerosol spread. So the risk of transmission of virus is more. But at home, the person, the family member assisting the patient, he'll be having a proper mask. The patient will be kept in a separate room. So I don't think there'll be a problem with aerosol spread at home. And you can leave the doors, windows open for an open one. They don't travel much distance. So just because of the aerosol spread, they advocate not to use a nebulizer machine. They ask to use a spray. But practically, nebulizer, it gives for some time. You can give it even with oxygen. If you have an oxygen concentrator or an oxygen cylinder at home, you can give it with oxygen. So you can give supplemental oxygen and all with that. So you can give it with nebulizer, provided you take precautions that there is no aerosols. Sorry, you cannot prevent aerosol spread. So other people in the home, they have proper PPE, they have proper mask and goggles just to prevent the mucous membrane spread. So you can just give it by nebulization. There is no wrong. So you can give your bronchodilators, you can give your steroids, and you can give your N-acetylcysteine by nebulization. So in all these aspects, what we have discussed as of now, none of them needs an ICU setting. None of them need at least a hospitalization. So you're giving paracetamol, you're giving an antiviral, you're giving steroid, you're giving some nebulization, and you're giving a mucolytic. So you think you'll be able to manage 80% of the patients without getting to a hospital. This is in the first 3 days, you hit them hard, for sure you'll not have a hospital exodus into the hospital. So these initial 3 to 4 days, we are, with all due respect to all colleagues, so even the patients, they are going over the counter, they buy Doxy, they buy Azithro. So we see a lot of patients who call me, doctor, we have started on Azithro from day 1. So they are wasting their valuable time. So they don't focus on control of fever. They don't focus on timely paracetamol. They focus on antibiotics, what antibiotic to take and all stuff, or what tests to do. Regarding the testing part, I'll tell you, I need for me to give the medications. I need 2 important investigations. Of course, the patient has access, the patient has financial resources, the patient is well affordable. You can write a big list of medications. But if you ask me, doctor, can you choose only 2 or 3 investigations? Yes. Sugars, of course, because we give steroids, we ask the patients to check sugars. That's fine. Basic counts, this is what we need, just to avoid, we see there is the platelets and the counts are normal. So even more than the counts, I advocate a serum creatinine. This is just because of fever, I want to check that there is no acute kidney injury for the patient. And I'm even giving favipiravir. So we just ask for a serum creatinine, especially the elderly patients who are not having an oral intake, we advise. Even if they don't have access for serum creatinine, what will it? Okay, drink a lot of fluids, give him hydration. This is what we do. The second thing is, I ask for a D dimer. I'm not asking for an LDH, ferritin. I don't say these investigations are not needed in the R, but I'll tell you, if you ask me, the D dimer is just because it will guide us whether you need to start on an anticoagulant for the patient or not. So whether you need to start a Clexane is costly, administration at home, practically not possible for everyone. So you have other anticoagulants like your apixaban, rivaroxaban, dabigatran. But what is the problem with giving these medications at home? Of course, though they are novel anticoagulants, at least you need their coagulation monitoring, INR, PT, platelets and all stuff. So if they can get a dimer, if the dimer is very well in the normal limits, a simple antiplatelet like aspirin will do. Because aspirin, it's an antiplatelet and an anti-inflammatory also. Aspirin is an anti-inflammatory and antiplatelet, of course at low doses. A simple antiplatelet will do if the dimer is sufficient. If the dimer is high, so we need to check what are all other reasons. In pregnancy, dimer can be high. In sepsis, dimer can be high. Not necessarily the patient has a clot in the lung or pulmonary embolism. In sepsis, dimer will be high. In pregnancy, dimer will be high. If the patient is taking any oral contraceptive pills or anything, dimer might be high. So this we see what are the other reasons for the dimer to be high. So this is again interpretation they can get to a doctor's help. This is a bit out of home care what I'm talking about, dimer or your creatinine. But rest of all things they can be done at home. Then further coming in. So you daily monitor the saturations of the patient. You just advocate them. What is more important among all of these? Your part of medications is only 50%. Rest of 50%, it will be like a foolish talk if you tell about lung mechanics, breathing exercises. So people are dying outside there. People are not getting remdesivir. People are not getting tocilizumab. People are not getting oxygen. And you are telling breathing exercises sitting at home? Yes, it's important. Because can you please tell me which drug you give into the vein or which drug you give in the mouth will open up your lungs? You have a collapsed lung segment. Which medication we take by mouth or through the vein will open up the lung? No. Only your spirometry will open up the lung. Only your spirometry, your deep breathing exercises, your steam, breaking of the mucus, mobilizing the mucus out, mobilizing the secretions out, just creating more aerated part of the lungs. These are the things will pick the saturations up. So you put a patient in ICU on his back, supine position, just give him remdesivir and steroid and leave him for the day. Do you think he'll improve? He has to sit up. We have to tap him well, do a good chest physio, give him spirometry, breathing exercises, steam, mucolytics, by nebulization, make him bring it out, all the expectorations out. This is when the saturations improve. The saturations are not going to improve with your paracetamol, what we have discussed. The saturations are not going to improve with your antiviral. The saturations are not going to improve with the steroid or any stuff. It is only the lung mechanics. So we advocate a lot of lung mechanics, which can be done at home. We can share videos with the patient's family. They'll be volunteering to do it. And even we talk about this lung mechanics. It's a one-to-one care at home. This is the advantage of at home. You have a one-to-one care and you have a family member supporting them. Example, with all due respect, the hospitals are so overwhelmed, especially the nursing staff, with all due respect and high regards for them. They are so overwhelmed. You have 10 patients for them to take care. They'll have their day exhausted just by finishing their medications at least. They go to each bed, they check the vitals, they give the administrated medications, their shift is done. Do you think these patients these staff, they'll have time to tap the chest, to position the patient, to change the position of the patient, to make him expectorate and all? They don't have time. This is the advantage we have at home. So you have all ample time. You have a single patient, one of the family member. You have other family members who can just help do a lot of physio. And from my experience, Dr. Bhavan knows what we have seen. All the youngsters who have assisted their parents or grandparents at home with a proper mask, I'm telling you, not a single youngster who has assisted them is turned out COVID positive. They put a proper mask. So see, if our family member doesn't help, do you think some nursing staff in a hospital, when we pay a hospital bill, they will do the job? No. It's we have to do it. So none of the youngsters, even now, so they started volunteering for other patients also. They are managing with a proper mask, of course, with a proper mask, with goggles. No, none of them, they were there with the patients. They were giving nebulizations. Though the aerosol spread is there, they were in the same room. None of them are sick. So it's not that none of them are sick. So we can advocate a lot of lung physio, chest physio, steam, nebulization, positioning, trying to keep your head end down and leg end up so that your secretions will drain up to the throat where you can spit it out. So this will create more aerated part of the lungs. This is, I advocate so much that we have seen. The last couple of days, we have seen patients with saturations, you will not believe it, 80. This is near Uyuru, Vijayawada and a lot of patients, 80 saturations. So we have tried all these chest physios nebulizations. So they didn't work much. Then we volunteered for a CPAP machine. We just gave a CPAP machine for a few hours. So what happens? All the atelectatic lung segments will open up. So once the collapsed lung segments are opening up, you're recruiting more alveoli into the respiration. You're recruiting more alveoli into the oxygenation. So automatically the saturation is picked up. But if you tell a patient with 85, so they will tell you, okay, the first thing, remdesivir. It's of course, I don't say don't give remdesivir. It's the discretion of the doctor who is taking care of the patient care in the ICU. But giving a remdesivir or steroid is not going to help the patient if the lung mechanics are not addressed properly. This is of pivotal importance. The lung mechanics has to be addressed. This is very important. And one more thing we need to warn the patients. Generally, by the end of first week, most of the patients are relaxed because their fever settled down. They are happy. Symptoms resolve. But the turbulent phase, what we have seen personally in the patients in India or here from what the 8th to 12th day is a turbulent phase. This is the phase where patient will be having a second episode of fever, probably by a bacterial infection. So this is when in the second week of fever, you need to consider giving an antibiotic. So you generally go for a broad coverage. Of course, again, here we are talking about the home care. So we are not talking about IV medications like your meropenem, imipenem, piperacillin, tazobactam or anything. Simple levofloxacin or any medication which you feel it covers all the gram-positive negatives and all. Start on an oral antibiotic on the second week if there is fever. And mostly between 8th to 12th day, what we are seeing a drop in saturations. We are seeing a drop in saturation. This is because the first week, patients have relaxed well. They are not advocating on physio because they have to spend time and energy. They just want to take some tablet and feel that they are okay. So who are not addressing the lung mechanics well on the first week, between 8th and 12th day, or most of them, they're having a very turbulent phase. You know, it's very difficult to bring them back once they desaturate. And starting lung physio, your nebulizations, chest physio, once desaturation, it's better you start it early. Again, you are priming the lungs well. So early therapies and all, they will help you to brace yourself for the turbulence which is going to come between 8th and 12th day. So once the 12th day is passed, so the only care what you think is embolic events. So you will be tapering down the steroids. Of course, you will stop antivirals. The antibiotic course will be finishing in 5 days to 1 week. Now you need to address the patient. You need to tell him at least to get a D-dimer at least done for you to decide how long the patient could be on an anticoagulant. And if the D-dimer is fine, will a simple antiplatelet be enough for the patient? So this is what you decide after the 12th day. So, but all through the phases, we need to counsel the patient well, just to tell few things. Be prepared for lack of smell, lack of taste, and don't expect that any medication is going to bring them back. This is a usual healing process which comes on its own. Patients, all of them will be complaining lack of sleep. So you can address them with a small 2 to 3 days of any benzodiazepine, short acting one for them, you can give them. So lack of sleep, changes in appetite, lack of smell, taste, cough, severe cough. Cough, what can we do for cough? You give a mucolytic, you give an expectorant, you give nebulization, you give steam and chest physio. This is all what you can do. In spite of doing all of these, still they complain of cough. You just need to reassure them. Be prepared for 2 to 3 weeks of cough. Just reassure them. Try all home remedies and all. It's not that a cough you start an antibiotic. So cough is one thing which you need to make them be prepared well. And low grade fevers, 99 to 100, they keep telling you, doctor, still second week, I still have 99 to 100. Yes, make them be prepared well that temperatures of 99 to 100 will be there till the end of second week for most of the patients. So let them not be panicky. They'll be keeping pestering you, doctor, the fevers are not settling, fevers are not, and they themselves will be trying to advise you. Doctor, do you think I need to start on an antibiotic now? Do you think I need to change the antibiotic? Do you think I need to take a second antibiotic? This is what they ask. If it's a low grade fever, ignore a fever of 99 to 100, ignore mild cough, ignore insomnia where the patients are complaining. But one thing what most of the patients complain is they feel that they are so weak, They even cannot move their little finger. They just lie down on the bed. They think that they're sinking and dying. If the patients have an access to any local practitioner or a nurse, you can ask them to get some IV, provided if they're not able to take orally. But if they're able to take orally, please advocate them from day one to drink in sips, continuous sips. This should be all through the week. So you're priming your body, you're not dehydrating your body. So once, at least hydration is the only thing which will keep your energy levels a bit high. So not a diet. No, you cannot eat your stomach full with all these medications, with all your oral ulcers, with all the medications and all. You cannot eat your stomach full. So we tell them, even you don't eat, no problem. Drink. Drink also, whatever fluid you want, juices, stuff and all. And monitoring system, once we start on steroids, especially elderlies and all, we ask them to monitor sugars. No? And most of them will be on metformin. So in this phase of dehydration, in this phase of giving antivirals and all, try to counsel them to take home insulin. That's better for a short bridge therapy. So once the sugars come down, they will switch back to their oral tablets. No, because these metformin combinations, no, they increase lactic acidosis, they increase again acute kidney injury, added on to this dehydration. So we can advocate them to start on insulin, any mixed preparation, twice a day to counteract the sugars. So you're managing dehydration, you're managing fevers, you're managing your sugars, you're managing your initial viral load with an antiviral, and you're managing the burst of fever, the surge of fever, presumably cytokine storm with a steroid, and you're managing with steam, nebulization, mucolytics, and inhalational steroids, inhalational mucolytics, or N-acetylcysteine combinations. This part of the treatment, this is what we advocated. This is what I have done personally. I think I can count in numbers the patients who have went to hospital, that too they're panicky and they went to a hospital. But I'll tell you, I'm not finding fault with the hospital care. They're so. After going to hospital, who is going to address their physios? Who is going to address their nebulization, steam, mucolytics, expectorations? They started to dip more in the hospital. The saturation started to drop down more. This is where the families, they start calling me doctor. Now they're asking me for convalescent plasma. They're asking me for a tocilizumab. They're asking me for a remdesivir. Of course, it's the discretion of the doctors. Let them give what they want. But any of these, does your plasma, does your tocilizumab, or does your remdesivir in the second week what you're giving, when the patient is desaturating, it will not pick up the saturations. You can advocate them if they have a facility to start on a BiPAP or a CPAP to open up the collapsed lung segment, because these CPAP machines in and around Vijayawada, we have bought most of them. We have made the patients buy. We have just told one thing to the patient. If you get to a hospital, if you have financial constraints, you pay 1 lakh per day or 50,000 per day. But just with 50,000, you get a machine. There are many who are buying a machine, who are not affordable. They are renting out a machine. They're hooking on a CPAP. 1 to 2 days, at least all the atelectatic lung segments or the collapsed lung segments open up. They recruit more into the circulation, and definitely the saturations will pick up. Your CPAP is more important than any drug I'll tell you in the ICU to open up your lung segments. This is what will improve your saturation. Your lung mechanics will improve your saturation. Your nebulizations, your steam, your physios, your mobilizations of secretions will increase the saturations more than any medication. And the second thing regarding, we have a lot of patients asking us, doctor, can you please see the CT scoring? I have a CT scoring of 23/25. In our group, we have a patient of CT scoring 23 out of 25. He has done his CT 10 days after the treatment. So he has done and come back. So I was speaking to our radiology colleagues, our colleague here in UAE, we were talking. So there is some CT scan is never used as a screening tool. It's not for a diagnosis of COVID. There are other indications where you use a CT scan. But unfortunately, I'm not telling it is wrong. Doctors are writing unnecessarily CTs, because if we order a PCR test, it comes after 2 days. So the CT is just 5 minutes job. Go get a CT scan, diagnose with the ground glass opacities. So because of the lack of a PCR or COVID testing, a delay in COVID testing, we are forced to push patients for CT, but still it's not needed. So you have your pulse oximeter, you have your thermometers, you have your symptoms of cough, fever. This itself is COVID for diagnosis in this scenario, in this current pandemic. We don't need any evidence for that. Unless the patient is, unless you see the patient as a potential lawsuit, this doctor has given me COVID treatment,
without a diagnosis. He didn't even test me for COVID. Unless you see a patient as a potential lawsuit, if the patient is in your line of treatment, the patient believes you, yes, go ahead. Don't waste time for any tests or anything. But if you think the patient is asking a lot of questions, doctor, how can you start on an antiviral or steroid for me without me being tested for positive or for COVID? Okay, I have done a COVID test for a patient. It has a lot of factors. So when I am the technician taking a COVID sample for PCR. So when I try to insert the swab into the nose, I'm afraid this patient will sneeze on me, cough on me. I will take a superficial sample. The result will be negative. It's a false negative. And very early in the phase of fever, very early in the day one of fever, you go for a COVID testing, it comes negative. And the patient will be under a false impression that he's not COVID. He is going to sit at home for 3 to 4 days where he's going to sink. So even you have a COVID report which is negative, but you have a clinician suspicion that this patient has a high-grade fever, cough, classical for this pandemic, you can start him on treatment. Try to talk to him that your report can be a false negative and we are wasting the golden hour. So how the PCR will help? Even it is negative, you clinically suspect, you start on the treatment. Okay, the PCR is positive. The patient has no fever, no cough, saturations are 99%. I don't give steroid for the patient. I don't give an antiviral. I just give some supplements and if needed, some fever. So you don't treat a patient because the patient is positive, you don't start on the protocol. Patient is negative, you don't deny him of the treatment even. If you still suspect, you can go ahead. Regarding the CT, the role of CT in this is, CT is just to differentiate how much of salvageable lung is there. That means they want to differentiate if it's ground glass opacities or there is any consolidation from any bacterial infection or there are any secretions which are pooled. Because why do we want to find pooled secretions? This is the part which we can bring it out of the lung. So if you have enough secretions on the CT, the radiologist can report you that not only ground glass opacities, there are a lot of secretions pooled up in this segment. We can position the patient, we can try to bring out the secretions. So this is where the CT or the radiologist role is very valuable. So, and in that even our radiologist colleagues, they advocate the patient lying on the back, you start on a CT and after that you do an ultra fast CT to minimize the radiation. Then you place the patient on prone position on the same CT table and you repeat it. Because this is which will tell you if the secretions are being drained or there are any secretions to be mobilized, because it will help you in the management. So it will tell you whether CPAP will help you or not. If there are any collapsed lung segments, yes, on the CT, the radiologist has given me an opinion that there are collapsed lung segments. So let me hook on a CPAP. So on the CT, the radiologist has told me that there are a lot of pooled secretions. Okay, let me bring out the secretions. So just for this treatment strategy, your CT scan is valuable, but not for diagnosis of COVID. For diagnosis of COVID, you can diagnose it from your office, from the patient's history, just for a fever, just with a body ache and cough, it is COVID in this scenario. You cannot think of other scenarios, because I've seen many lab investigations telling it is typhoid and all. So they could have a cross reactivity, positivity with other tests and all, but just don't focus. So typhoid, what is it going to happen? It's not going to rapidly cause a downhill course in the next 1 to 2 days. The patient is not going to desaturate because he'll have a high grade fever, he'll be dehydrated. You'll be starting, if even you miss a typhoid for 1 to 2 days, nothing will happen. But you miss a COVID in a desaturating patient, you're wasting the golden hour. Okay, you're missing a dengue fever. What will happen? There is no specific treatment for dengue. It's just only paracetamol. So no problem, even you miss that. But COVID, just empirically think it is COVID in this scenario and we can go ahead. So basic outline will be your temperature management, break the cycle of fever, hydrate very well the patient, nicely prime the patient well, that you are preparing him well for the next, on the second, third day, the patient is not responding, you're going to start him on antiviral. So you are priming him from day one. And then after that comes your steroids, then your mucolytics, your nebulizations. Last in the list will be your supplements, your chest physio, your positioning, your drainage. If possible, if the patient is affordable and access, because it's simple home care, a CPAP machine, that is you are giving just a room air, because right now you don't have oxygen. You cannot get an oxygen cylinder. You cannot get an oxygen concentrator and all stuff. And with this, you're giving a simple room air with positive pressure, which is opening up the lung segments, which will work out in most of the patients. And the other concern, what we can see is most of the friends or family, they're more concerned about mucormycosis or black fungus. Doctor, you're giving me a lot of steroids. I have read in the newspapers and media that steroids will have risk of black fungus. So I'll have risk of black fungus. You're giving me a lot of steroids. Yes. This steroid specifically, patients who are immune compromised completely, uncontrolled diabetes, uncontrolled. It is not in this acute phase of steroid. Long-term HbA1c of 11, 12 and all. These patients are immune compromised. So you give steroids, you don't give steroids, or this patient goes to an ICU, he will easily catch the infection from other patients. So it comes as a nosocomial infection. It is not from your steroid administration. So it is from the patient's immune levels, which he is getting mucormycosis, not from your steroid administration. How much time are we giving steroids? 1 week, 2 weeks maximum? You're not giving him a lifetime steroids to put him fully immune suppressed, right? And this tocilizumab drug, which they are giving in ICU care and all, it's a double-edged sword. So this will suppress the immunity levels so low, they'll have risk of mucormycosis. And at home care, you have patients taking home oxygen with a humidifier. So they don't change the water in the humidifier. They don't clean it well. They just they keep refilling the same container without cleaning the container and the cork, which is just flushing out air. No, so they don't clean that. And your home CPAP machines and your home oxygen concentrators, or even your home nebulizer, you have a filter in that. So at least weekly, once you take the filter, you just clean the filter, de-dust the filter, keep the filter back, see if the filter is functional, or you change the filter. So simple home care techniques. Clean your humidifier, keep the filters properly in your nebulizer machine or your oxygen concentrator or your home CPAP machines. That's fine. This is what you can do. Nothing more than that to prevent mucormycosis. So mucormycosis is something which patients are catching, not at homes. This is from unhealthy environment, unhealthy usage of your home care equipment, and in the hospital contacting it from other patients when their immunity levels are very low. So the patient, someone tell you of mucormycosis and steroids. So not the mucormycosis which is going to come late. The COVID is going to kill the patient. So if it is advocated, we should give it. There's no doubt. If it's indicated, yes, you give steroids. You cannot think of immune suppression, mucormycosis stuff and all like that. And we have seen the dosing of steroids, Dexa, methylprednisolone, your prednisolone, or EVIS. And regarding remdesivir and favipiravir, how they're not still FDA approved. If you open your Lancet or journals, you can see multiple studies. Each drug is having 10 to 15 studies which are in trial still. The final results of the trials are not out yet. There are only in vitro studies. But to reduce the viral load and to reduce the hospital stay, yes, antivirals have a role. But still, the side effect profile is not fully established. So this antivirals, you are going to give it for a week or 10 days. What is the side effect profile, long-term effects or short-term effects? They are still yet to come out. But keeping in view of the current pandemic, and we see it's a double-edged sword, right? So we see we just outweigh the benefits versus the risks. So no, the risks from the side effects of the antivirals are very less and the benefits are more. So we are still advocating use of this favipiravir or your remdesivir. But of course, remdesivir is for a hospital setting. It's for patients with low saturations and it is based on availability. And I'll tell you, if there is no remdesivir available, please will not tell the patient's family to bring it. You know, patient family will have a guilt. They'll be telling, okay, the doctor has asked me to get a drug. I'm unable to get it for my family just because of my patient didn't recover well. Do you think simple not giving a remdesivir will make a change there? You have an alternative. You have a favipiravir, and that too in the second week it has much less role. So please advocate the patients. What resources are available, we'll ask them to get. So we are trying to do the best from the available resources. We don't want to talk about big things. Bring a tocilizumab, bring a remdesivir. They're not available for the patient. What the patient will do? Where will he go? When you cannot tell the stockist, when you cannot source it from your pharmacy, please will not tell the patient what are not available for them. What are available, we have plenty in hand to counteract this. From day one, if you start, I will tell you, none of them will get to an ICU. And if you focus on lung mechanics and all.
That was a nice presentation, sir. Thank you so much for enlightening us about the home isolation techniques and those which can be managed at home and all. So we have a few questions which were raised by our colleagues.
Okay.
I guess most of them were answered. I don't, maybe a few of them can be repeated though.
Yes.
So the first one coming out, what are the care and precautions which needs to be taken by a primary contact who is either symptomatic or asymptomatic?
Okay. This is one thing which I didn't address in the topic. See, I have an elderly or an young family member at home who's sick and I'm trying to assist. The first thing I'll try to isolate the children and elderly from this sick contact. And if I am taking care of him, I will put a proper mask and just to avoid the aerosol spread into my mucous membrane and a tightly fitted goggle and a mask, and I'll try to address the patient. I will try to keep him away from the rest of the family members. And when I go near the patient, I will not come back and again mingle with other family members. So this whole week I'll be dedicated for his care only. So this is where you can just try to break the cycle and just don't keep the room closed. So we have heard of aerosol spread. Aerosol spread will not be for meters and kilometers together. It will be for a short distance. It doesn't fly in the air for kilometers together. So you can just keep the room well ventilated, open, and let fresh air, lot of fresh air come in, and see that you cut off the patient and the primary contact who is taking care of them from the rest of the family members. Simple measures like a face mask, and even if I am taking care of a family member who is sick, I will monitor my temperatures. I will monitor my saturations. So frequent monitoring along with the patient, I will monitor myself even because I should be fit enough.
Dr. UVR, can you go for the next one?
That was a really fantastic presentation by Dr. Shashi, and I hope it has enlightened all our dental faculty regarding the hospital, the home isolation care for COVID patients. And here are some of the questions from my side, which the participant has been taken. How do you decide on discharge of a COVID affected patient from hospital? What if their oxygen saturation levels are low and fluctuating?
Okay. So you admit a patient, the criteria for discharge will be for a patient will be fever-free state. The patient is not having any fever. That means the patient is not having any secondary bacterial, viral, or any fungal infections. Fever-free state. You see that the patient is infection-free. Second thing, a consistent saturation levels above even 90. See, we don't see an actual value. 90 is low when compared to a normal value above 95. But if this 90 is consistently staying for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, it is not coming down to 89, 88, 87. I'm happy with this even 90. This is a stable value. And generally what we see, early morning drops, even for a patient who is admitted in the hospital at home, we see early morning drops. The reason for early morning drops, when we sleep, we have a tongue fall. And our airway, when we are awake, we keep it open and patent. So when we are sleeping based on the pillow, what we are having behind our neck and all, we keep it flexed. So you'll have a kinking in the airway. So your airway is not patent. So the first thing in the early morning, what I have seen commonly, if someone tells I'm not able to short of breath, saturations are low, position the airway, tap the back, put him on his prone position, just do all these measures, simple techniques, 100% the saturations will pick up. 100% the saturations will pick up. So it's just, so when we are planning to discharge a patient, we educate the patient how to drain the secretions out, to see that he's doing his spirometry well, to see whatever his saturations are. I don't bother even his saturations are 88 or 89, but they should be consistently same. They should not be in a downhill phase. So 89, 90, 91, still there, because we cannot keep them in the hospital. They'll be getting a lot of nosocomial infections from the hospital. The earlier we try to push him out of the hospital. So, but we counsel them for a monitoring device at home, positioning of the airway, nebulization, secretions, and the patient is affordable, a CPAP or a backup of oxygen at home, just in case. Because you have hypoxic episodes even in the 3rd week also after discharge. So we cannot keep a patient for 3 weeks. So you counsel, you educate, you teach the patient well. He will know how to handle the catastrophe. What happens if it desaturates? First thing, he'll not be panicked. He'll know. He'll keep his airway open. He'll lie prone. Additional family member will go. We'll tap him. We'll do a neb, steam stuff. So this will improve. So simple patient education.
a consistent level of saturation, irrespective of the value, a single value. We see the trend is stable. Yes, the patient will be for discharge.
So, how do you suggest about the prophylaxis for COVID? I mean, like your home prophylactic measures or any particular medications you suggest or any other resources which are available?
The only prophylaxis for COVID is a mask. No drug documented till date, not your doxy, not your ivermectin, not your hydroxy, nothing is a prophylactic drug. There is no approved prophylactic drug for COVID. The only prophylaxis will be get a mask, buy a pulse oximeter. So if you are exposed to a COVID patient, don't run for an investigation. It will be negative on day 1, day 2, when you're not throwing symptoms. When you start having symptoms, just keep monitoring your fever saturations. Start with simple fever lowering techniques like paracetamol, that's all. Your prophylaxis starts with paracetamol when the fever starts. Before that, nothing. It's just monitoring, wait and watch. You just wait and watch for the symptoms or fever to come up. And this is when we act. We don't jump in for the, even you give a day before the saturations or fevers or symptoms, even you give an antiviral steroid, no role of these, no drug.
Yeah. How do we decide on selecting an oxygen concentrator, and what are the specifications to purchase one? So, and does this oxygen concentrators give us the maximum oxygen what we require?
Yeah. So the oxygen concentrators, between when the first wave is done, we are all relaxed before the second wave set in. They were calling us Dr. Philips oxygen concentrator. We have it for 50,000. You want to take it? Now they're telling the same as 120. So now you have now even you want to go for a branded, you cannot find a branded one in the market anywhere. So all you have some odd companies coming in. So this time for an oxygen concentrator to plan a standard one, you cannot plan. I think once the pandemic settles, everyone is quiet, then this is a time where we go for a standard one and we keep it. Right now, you don't have an option. The easily available one in the market is the best oxygen concentrator, I'll tell you. Who is ready to give it to you today or tomorrow? That is the best oxygen concentrator. And in that, there are specifications of 93% purity and all. But we need to see the filtration system, the filters and all, because it filters from the room air. Just see, because of you need to have proper filters, HME filters. This filtration system is very important for especially home nebulizers, home oxygen concentrators. This is what we advocate, especially in this background of this black fungus or mucormycosis. Any oxygen concentrator, whichever is available, will be do. But when you buy, sometimes the next time, if you're really planning one, we have not a single family member. I have seen many family members, 2, 3 affected. So what we did, there is a single oxygen concentrator at home. So what we did, we made a Y bend. We put a Y bend and we put 2, and we are giving 2 liters for one patient and 2 liters for one patient. So maximum it gives 5. So we have some oxygen concentrators which give 10 liters, and some oxygen concentrators have dual ports, 5 liters from one port, 5 liters from the other port. So 2 patients can use. But just making use of the resources, a single oxygen concentrator, I have seen a family, they used a Y bend, and with Y bend 2, and after half an hour, switch roles. The elderly people have come in and they are taking it for some time. They're switching roles. So the people who are off oxygen, they're going and lying down on their prone position. And then they're coming back for half an hour oxygen. So single oxygen concentrator also 4 to 5 family members have managed. So in this scenario, whatever is available is the best one.
Yes, as you said, it is very much required to use the situation what is there aptly. And I have seen in television also a doctor using a stethoscope for giving an oxygen,
Yes.
and he has discharged for 2 people. So that's a great deal. Yeah, Mr. Bhavan, next question.
Yeah, so just we have a question in the chat box. So how do you decide the percentage of oxygen that has to be given in a home isolation procedure?
So whatever the patient needs 1 liter, 2 liters, 3 liters, it doesn't matter. Your target oxygen value should be touching 94. So to achieve 94, you give 1 liter, he's achieving 94, you fix him at 1 liter. But he's achieving 94 at 2 liters, it is all a titration technique, that's all. Your value is 94. Your required target saturation on a pulse oximeter should be 94, and you titrate oxygen accordingly. Example, you have a home oxygen concentrator which gives only 5 liters. So you have opened up full 5 liters. The patient is still in 85. He's struggling. He's not touching even 90s. This is when I try to use an additional CPAP mask. So when you're augmenting the home oxygen with a CPAP mask, yes, he will touch 90s, 91s. So it's all a playing around with your home oxygen and your CPAP. Still the patient is not. Try to change the position, prone him, tap him well, give a good nebulization. Try to put him in reverse trend line back position. In your dental chair, the patient will be keeping your head end. So you just try to still lower the head end low. So all the lung secretions will come near the throat and he can bring it out. So just try to position the patient and do whatever measures you can. Again, using the limited resources, what you can, you'll be able to touch 94. So in spite of giving oxygen 5 liters, CPAP, still if the patient is not struggling, still the patient is not rising up, this is where you cannot drag the patient in. You have to ask him to get admitted in a hospital. But in our scenario, Dr. Bhavan knows, we are given CPAP, we are given oxygen. You will not believe the patient's saturations are 75, 80. The patient he didn't have an option. He said, no, I don't have money to go to a hospital. We managed him. Today is the 15th day. They brought him out. They made him sit without oxygen. He's touching 90 today. Just some patients, even a 75, 80 saturations. I have 6 cases who just left a free hand for me because they are not affordable to get to a hospital. Only with 5 liters oxygen and CPAP. In spite of giving them, for 1 week, it was a struggle, 80, 85, 80, 85. So in the last 3-4 days, they started to come up 86, 87, 90. Now they're crossing 90s. So it's again a resources. The patient doesn't have, the patient has an option to go, he can afford a healthcare. And here the problem is not affordability. I have a lot of money I can afford. Someone has to give me a bed in ICU, in a proper ICU setting. So a simple bed in a hospital is not going to save me. A simple bed in a hospital with an oxygen, it is not. You have a bed at home, you have an oxygen at home. So how will a hospital differ from that? So hospitalization is only when you're in an advanced care. If you are needing a ventilator care, when you're needing an additional convalescent plasma, your tocilizumab infusions, your remdesivir infusions, this is when you go. A simple someone tells you, I have a bed in a hospital with oxygen, come, no. I have a better bed at home. I have a better person to take care at home. I have an oxygen backup at home. I don't need this bed in the hospital.
Yeah. Question from my side. Generally, we are seeing a lot of patients after recovery, they are developing some complications. And could you please, can you please enlighten us on post-operative care on mild, moderate, and severe cases? And what about their diet restrictions or diet management? And how do you manage weakness and fatigue and cough after COVID?
So unfortunately, really to be frank, fatigue and weakness, it's a difficult medical condition to treat. You give a neurobion injection or you give a neurobion drip, it is not going to relieve him. It is only a time-taking process. It's only a healing phase. I have seen patients who have taken months, at least minimum. There are patients who have taken 2 months to come back to the normal phase. Still a lot of fatigue, myalgias. Only thing what we can advocate them is one thing: proper diet, proper hydration, proper sleep. And one important thing what we need to address, 2 important things I'll tell you. One is regarding the heart, I'll tell you, and regarding the lung. Of course, a discharged patient, please follow up on a D-dimer. This patient might need an antiplatelet or anticoagulant because we don't want any embolic events. We don't want a PE for a patient who is discharged. So this is the only life-threatening event, a PE, pulmonary embolism. So we'll focus on a D-dimer testing and starting of an anticoagulation. This is one important thing. And most of them, they'll still have that inflammatory response in the body for a longer period. And if you see a recovered patient, though he's not having fever, you see his resting heart rates 110, 120. His resting heart rates are high. His resting heart rates are very high. Try not to bring them down to complete normal. So you cannot, because the body compensatory mechanism will collapse again. A 120 heart rate, first we try to address what are the causes. Is a heart rate because of fever? Is a heart rate because of hypotension? Is a heart rate because of any heart event or any pulmonary embolism? Once you rule them out, you feel that this is simple tachycardia from this inflammatory response, you try to give a small ivabradine or a small dose of beta blocker if the patient is not asthmatic or anything. This will bring down the below 100, 80, 90 is even acceptable for me. I don't want it to be in 60s or 70s because you are completely blocking the compensatory tachycardia. So higher heart rates is one thing what you need to address, and embolic events is one thing what, these are the only two things what you can physically address by giving a drug. We cannot address the weakness, sir. We cannot address the fatigue. We cannot address the cough other than over-the-counter cough syrups or some medications, nebulization, steam. More than that, we cannot offer much for the patient. Just we need to counsel them and be prepared well. And fevers even, post-discharge, if someone is complaining of headache, sinus tenderness, any blurring of vision or anything, just one differential diagnosis right now is mucormycosis. Of course, when we try searching for it, we will not find it. You will never find. So some patient we miss, this patient will end up with some other, our colleague, and our colleague will pick up the diagnosis. So just have in mind of this mucormycosis, your pulmonary embolism events or any embolic events, and your tachycardia addressing after the discharge. These are the main things what we can address.
As you were talking about the fever, post-operative fever after 3 weeks, will that have any significance without any ophthalmologic issues?
Yeah. Fever after a discharge is from your hospital acquired infections, your secondary bacterial or your fungal, because a viral phase has gone. So now we need to work him up fever. We need to draw blood cultures for the patient, because this is when he needs. So this is when the patient needs the blood test. But here one thing. So we have seen patients who have recovered. After recovery, these patients went for random blood tests, and their CRPs we have seen in the ranges of 250s, 200s, 100s. So one CRP value. So here we cannot run behind this CRP, because this same patient would have had a CRP of 350 or 400 when he's under our care, and now he's in the declining phase. So we'll not see one value, we see a trend. You see an abnormal value, we just try to address the issue. You try to give an antibiotic or address the fever, try to kind the cause, you treat it. After 3 to 4 days, you try to repeat the investigation, and you see if it's a downtrend. Though the value is abnormal, you can ignore it. So 3rd week of fevers, we try to work up with blood cultures, a chest x-ray to find out, because we have seen patients with pneumonitis, secondary bacterial pneumonia, pleurisy, because they complain of severe chest pain, pleurisy in the chest. This is because of secondary bacterial pneumonias, or your fungal, you have aspergillosis fungus, mucormycosis and all. So it needs bit of extensive workup. 3rd week of fever is not a good sign actually. He needs an extensive workup.
And regarding
the fever protocol, you do a fever protocol.
Regarding the mucormycosis also, as we are in the discussion of that, I have a question here. Any chances of developing mucormycosis in home isolation patient, and or any immune related issues later on?
If the patient is immune competent, the patient is not under any long-term immune suppressants, if the patient is not on any chemotherapies, and if the patient is not with good HbA1c, though he is diabetic, we don't care. If the patient's HbA1c are well controlled, your steroids, what you are giving at home, definitely it will not cause mucormycosis. No doubt in that. But if the patient is on, you see patients on long-term home oxygen, you see their humidifiers, they're not even clean. You can see that black crust also on that. If you scrub it, you can remove all of that. So these patients are at high risk. But patients who de novo, fresh patients with your short course of 1 week, 2 week steroids, no. Very, very, very likely chances. See, we have seen in the news telling that there are 50 patients, 100 patients of mucormycosis. What is the number of COVID patients we are having right now in India today? It's in crores. And the sick patients are in lakhs. And we are talking about a few hundreds of mucormycosis, but we are not talking about thromboembolic patients, which are in thousands. We are seeing sudden cardiac deaths. We are seeing thromboembolism from PE, pulmonary embolism. So these are much more than mucormycosis. So this is, people are under a fear because people have much more important concerns to be worried about or to be addressed, like your embolic events, because there are more embolic deaths than a mucormycosis death. There are more deaths secondary to sepsis from the 3rd week of fever, which are not addressed properly, than your mucormycosis. So home with your short-term steroids in a fully immune competent person with a hygienic environment, with the hygienic nebulizers or steamers, home CPAPs or home oxygenations with proper filtration techniques, no, you don't have a risk of mucormycosis.
So what's the isolation period in COVID patient and how do we decide one? We see symptoms like cough even after the 14th day, right? So how infective are they? I mean, how do you decide the isolation period?
Yeah. Right. Good question. After the 10th day, not in the 12th, 10th to 12th day is the end of the phase where the patient can give virus to someone else. He cannot spread between the 10th and 12th day. So between the 10th and 12th day, so this is the time where end of the phase where you spread to others. This is the phase where you end the spread to others. And one more thing, you have seen patients who have recovered from COVID. Up till 8th week, you get a PCR swab, it is positive. This is just from a dead viral shredding only. It is not from a live virus. So here a positive patient will not be infective to others. Take this into account and keep him in isolation. So 12th day, and especially if you are given antiviral, he's out of isolation.
So in case they need to get a follow-up RT-PCR if they're particular, when do you suggest it?
So I think it's a 12th day. After the 12th day, yes, no, he's not infective anymore.
Right.
How do we differentiate hypoxia from a real-time fall of oxygen saturation?
The happy hypoxia is where the patient, you can diagnose it only when you put a pulse oximeter, you see his saturations are 65. His respiratory rate also will not be high. He'll not be even tachypneic, because if he's tachypneic, obviously he'll come to a hospital very early. Incidentally, he'll be coming for a fever checkup or a positive when you put on the hook on the saturations. So this is where you see a saturation surprisingly 65, but the patient is quite comfortable. He is not tachypneic, he's not cyanotic or anything. This is so you have a good response. These patients recover well. But you see a patient with a happy hypoxia of 65, and you see a similar patient of 65 who is tachypneic. This tachypneic patient is not going to do well. Patient with happy hypoxia, you give him oxygen, you start him on the management, you give him necessary CPAP or positive pressure ventilations, he will do well. So you don't intubate a patient who is very comfortable with a saturation of 65. But a same patient, this is a happy hypoxia patient, a patient with a similar pattern, COVID infected, saturation 65, which have dropped, severely tachypneic, gasping, using all the accessory muscles of respiration. You need to intubate this patient. This is just the patient effort. You can see and tell him how comfortable he is. So if the patient is comfortable, don't drag him or push him to something. Just we still slowly escalate the treatment. You hook him on oxygen, you start your antiviral steroids and all. You follow up the patient day-to-day basis. You see if he's improving, fine. So we are still comfortable with the happy hypoxia patient if he's maintaining with an oxygen. You don't intubate him or do anything.
We do have a lot many questions still, but I think the time is somewhat constrained, and last couple of questions to go, if you permit, Dr. Shashi.
Yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, in COVID long haulers, how do we treat phantosmia?
Yeah. So so we see patients telling that they cannot smell for a long time. So we see patients, other sect of patients who say they smell abnormally. So the problem with this abnormal smell is there is no management for this. Just like your anosmia, you just wait and watch for them to recover. But the problem with these patients is, example, if there is a gas leak at home, they'll be smelling it as a sweet taste. They'll not be able to diagnose. So it will be a hazard for them. So it will not be a hazard for him. It will be an environmental hazard. So he has taken out some food from the refrigerator. He wants to eat it. The food which is 2 to 3 days old. Because of this phantosmia, what happens? He will smell it sweet. He will smell it in a different phase, so he will eat it and he will end up in a food poisoning. So this is a matter of concern rather than this itself. So eventually they'll recover, but they should be cautious. So they should.
Hello, doctor.
So I think
yes. So we have Dr. Ranganath Venugopal sir, the President, Karnataka State Dental Council with us. So we asked sir for his insights. and any add-ons if you have on the program, sir. It's great to have
Thank
you
you.
here.
Thank you. Thank you. It was an excellent lecture, Dr. Shashi. I have one question. In India, what happens, we have many asymptomatic patients where pulse oximeters are not available. And is there any other monitoring can they do?
To be very frank, sir, for two scenarios, we don't have a clinical base, for a patient with a renal disease.
Yeah.
Advanced, of course, I'm not talking about patients who are on dialysis, patient with a renal disease. The only way you can diagnose is not from any clinical science. It's a biochemistry test called serum creatinine. In a similar way, you need a pulse oximeter. We don't have much
if it is not available and if there is no symptoms at all, and how do you how exactly they'll come to know that their saturation is dropping? In case even if it drops, as you said, that if they are on happy hypoxia, is there a chances for them to recover on
so
the
happy hypoxia? Happy hypoxia will not be alone, sir. Most of the time, it will start with a febrile illness. So he'll be having a fever, body aches, myalgias. So it won't be that silent. That without any symptoms, without fever, without body aches, without myalgias, without cough, simple drop in saturations, no, we haven't seen. So patients with happy hypoxia who we are seeing, they have fevers, ignored and neglected fevers. So for sure, you will have a clinical symptom before happy hypoxia in terms of fever, in terms of, you're able to see me?
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of fever, in terms of cough, in terms of body aches and all, it will give a clue for the patient. It doesn't come with only happy hypoxia. So when these symptoms are there, definitely he should get access to it. So you need not buy actually. You have some local practitioners in the village who come in the evening. If there'll be 5-6 patients, they'll just keep the pulse oximeter for that day. They will see the saturations are fine. At least for the day it's checked. They check on the next day. Of course, this is a problem because even you have an access to pulse oximeter, you have a lot of errors in that. They're not functioning properly.
Yeah.
Yes, you have a lot of issues with them.
For us as a dentist, we cannot take any call on COVID patients directly because physicians need to handle. What role can we play at this particular moment as a part of a dentist?
Okay. So do you think, yes, of course, only physicians can fit in the role, but in this pandemic, do you think the patients who are just trying for an online consultations and they are waiting? Hospitals are so overwhelmed. The physicians, they cannot tell this is my piece of cake and I'm only going to treat these patients. It's time you people have to take a role, come forward and manage these patients. We are not putting a stent or we are not doing any bypass surgeries. We have to take initiatives. So you can see a patient. You are not doing something, we are not doing a treatment which is not unauthorized or something big enough. You're not doing a surgery which is not in your field, or you're not encroaching onto the other one. You're just helping the medical fraternity and you're trying to reduce the load on the existing system. No? So it's only when you take a role, lead forward, you can do this. So
to what level can we able to prescribe these drugs?
So,
I mean,
you can manage fever for sure. You can manage fever for sure. You can counsel the patient regarding the saturation system and alerting system. And I don't know if it's possible. You are talking about a dentist not able to prescribe a favipiravir, but the patient, rural medical practitioners are prescribing meropenams. And we are talking about a system where the patient himself is walking into the pharmacy and buying favipiravir. Why can't you prescribe a favipiravir?
Okay.
If you don't prescribe, the patient is going and buying it himself. So at least if you prescribe, you will know the side effects. You will counsel, you will talk to the patient.
No, what do you mean to say? We need to have we have to work under a physician who can guide us and get into the system, or directly can we handle it? So because tomorrow, if anything happens, we have to refer immediately.
Only for a medico-legal purpose, you need a physician. So under your roof, you have a parallel physician practicing. Physician is managing 100 patients. So he'll not be able to manage the whole load. He might be seeing 50. Rest 50 you can see, of course, under his guidance. So even medico-legally, it's under the supervision of a physician. You can tell them.
So we need to have one physician who can always guide us and okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you. It was a wonderful lecture. You cleared all the doubts of us.
Okay. One last question before I introduce a senior most faculty. So we were told that the systemic corticosteroids should not be given in viral replication phase. Is that right?
Yeah.
And how do we?
It is right. It is right. And this is what we discussed in the beginning of the discussion. The first thing what we are starting with an antipyretic. In spite of giving antipyretics like your paracetamol, tepid sponging, lot of hydrations, if your fevers are not controlled, your second choice of drug is not the steroid, because it's the viral replication phase where we are taking the help of an antiviral. So you're starting the antiviral here. We are not starting a steroid here. You are starting steroid in the late phase when the patient is dipping saturations, or you are suspecting a cytokine storm from an outburst of temperatures. In spite of starting paracetamol and antiviral, still high grade fevers, still dipping saturations. This is when, so this is the time you start steroids. We can't even still wait further long. So this is a timely intervention of steroids, no? Because you are starting it when you are suspecting a cytokine storm and when you are suspecting a low sat. Of course, when you're monitoring and the saturations are lowering. Yes, that is true that you don't start steroids in early viral replication phase.
Nice one, sir. So we have Dr. Karnakar, sir, Principal Pania Dental College, Hyderabad here. So I request sir to be on the screen and give his valuable insights and any clarifications if needed.
Good evening, everyone. Hope I am audible.
Yes, sir. You're
audible.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. And it was really worth a Sunday afternoon we all could have. Particularly, the topic is covered from basics to the all protocols of home isolation and management of COVID. And just one more, my query or most of us, the apprehension is these private concentrators what are available in market, really whether they are reliable or whether they can be kept as an adjunct at home.
They're not reliable, sir. For example, you are planning to buy a concentrator for a future use. Please don't buy this. These concentrators, what you are planning to buy right now, are only for an emergency use. Patient is in acute need of oxygen at home, no access to cylinders or anything. You are compelled and cornered to buy them. That's all. Otherwise, no, we don't even have a choice. So you go, you don't have a choice. This is available, you have to buy them. You don't have 3-4 choices to select them. And even right now, we have choices. We don't know the brands. We don't know the technology on what basis it was developed and all. All of the thing is so now we have seen people going to an extent telling, I might need oxygen requirement only for 10 days. I might recover by then. If this oxygen concentrator, even I'm spending 1 lakh, if this works for this 10 days, this is well enough. This is the mindset of the people right now. So yeah, we don't have much choice. I think once this pandemic is gone, I think once this pandemic is settled down, we have to plan it properly, see a proper branding, see a proper technology, proper manufacturer, and then select and choose one. We cannot select amidst crisis. Yes.
Thank you very much. That has really helped all of us, and we wish to continue your association in future too.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
So the last one, sir, I have the last one in the message box. How often should one get tested for D-dimer during post-recovery COVID recovery phase to be on a safe side and to avoid embolism?
So here again, it comes on the risk factors. If someone is very obese, you have risk factors for diabetes, previous history of heart disease. So okay, at least during the recovery phase, in the whole month, in the 3 months post-recovery, at least you should be doing it once a month at least. No? At least you should be doing once a month. And provided at least even if the values are normal, there is no wrong in taking an antiplatelet like an aspirin or clopidogrel. I'm not talking about an anticoagulant. Definitely if the dimer is high, we go for an anticoagulant. If the dimer is normal, you start an antiplatelet, you continue, at least you are covered. And based on the availability, you can get it once or twice, that's all. If you're covered with an antiplatelet, at least you're covered and safe. You can give monthly once in the next 3 months, and consecutively if all the values of dimers are normal, you can ignore and stop any anticoagulant on a long-term basis.
Dr. Shashi, one last question from my side and we'll end this. At this particular pandemic situation, conjunctivitis, will it be having a significant symptom? Can we consider it as a significant symptom now?
Yeah. Conjunctivitis, it's like any other viral conjunctivitis. This is COVID-19 is virus. Just like many patients presenting with simple headache or loss of smell, sometimes they present only with loss of smell or they present with only body aches. There are cases which presented just with conjunctivitis only as an initial symptom. So even in conjunctivitis, of course, we follow the protocol. If it is a viral one, you just give only some topical analgesics, and to prevent secondary bacterial, you can give some. But even with a conjunctivitis patient coming in, you want him to watch for fever, check his saturations, and see for symptoms of cough. In the next 2 to 3 days, he will start showing these symptoms.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Don, you can take over.
Yes, sir. So anyone else, any doubts or any clarifications from, so all the doubts which are posted in the messages and those were clear, I guess.
Yeah,
Right,
maximum we had taken up all the questions, Don.
Yes, there are few in Facebook and YouTube links. So maybe it's a time constraint. It's been more than 1.5 hours. He's been standing, and yeah, it's been a very patient lecture. We thank you for being here on the afternoon, Sunday afternoon, as I said. So I pass the thing over to Dr. Ajay Banerjee, Secretary, IDA AP State.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Shashi Garu. Thank you for sparing a wonderful time, valuable time also. So since 2 days you are with us and giving us a lot of insights on how we need to take up the program. And also I really appreciate our the research committee team, and who has taken up all the queries from the local branch, and the guidance committee also, who has come up with a lot of queries. They put up the points to be taken up in this webinar. Our moderators, Dr. Chaudhary and Dr. Bhavan, and our Madam Dr. Sirisha Garu, President Dr. Satish. Thank you each one of you. And mainly thing, I thank the local branch also for taking up this task and come out with the innovative idea of doing this COVID care or COVID guidance in the home isolation. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sisi. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank
You
you
can
all.
close the session. Right.
Yeah.